I think it's also interesting to argue to which extent, while many people will say, well, this election has been influenced by certain country like Russia, this election has been influenced by China. It's also interesting to argue to what's the line you can't cross in influencing election, because obviously putting information out in the media can be in a way perceived as election interference, but is actually not. So like what's the line where we can't cross?
I think that's a very good question, because the first question is what is manipulation and what is information and
Exactly,
what is opinion. Yeah. So freedom of opinion, obviously anybody can voice their opinion. I think when it comes to a deliberate idea of wanting to mislead people by showing, for example, a fake video, that is where I would see the line, because it's impossible to argue against it, right? You can say, well, this is fake news. Well, anybody calls anything that they don't like fake news. So where I see the line is when it comes to what some people call the post-truth age, when it's impossible to argue anything.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Because the opposite party will simply say, that's a lie. And nobody will be able to know whether or not it's a lie. And the other question is, what is a foreign interference? So I do think that particularly superpowers or so-called superpowers should not directly interfere in national elections. That has been a rule for a long time. So Elon Musk's direct interference in favor of the AFD in Germany, for example, in the recent election, is definitely a step too far.
So when it comes to somebody funding the campaign from abroad, is that election interference for you?
Well, we have campaign funding rules. They are national rules and they're different in every country, and they're there for a purpose. I happen to think that ours in the UK is in need of some reform, because we need to have transparency. We need to have a limit to the degree to which elections can be funded. And yes, of course, if you have, the possibility of buying votes or buying elections, then we might just as well do away with democracy altogether and just admit that the world is now ruled by a very small number of oligarchs.
Yeah, interesting discussion, because I think with Elon Musk, he's stepped foot in his way of speaking, in his way of tweeting things. He stepped foot in many countries, and you can say interfered with many of potentially elections. AFD now gained an enormous amount of votes in Germany, and it could be argued, although, has he funded AFD?
So we don't know the details, but that's neither here nor there, because the mere possibility that he could, and the idea that his influence is such that he can make or break entire parties quite easily, really. And obviously he is not an elected official. That in and of itself tells me there is something very, very wrong with democracy, that somebody can accumulate so much power in their hands that they effectively are running the show behind the scenes. I mean, take the example of Greenland, right? So Donald Trump wants Greenland for the mineral wealth that he suspects.
We don't really know whether he wants it.
Well, let's assume he wants it. Let's assume he wants it because of, some hidden wealth that he thinks exists and may very well exist under the ice in Greenland. There are only something like 65,000 or so inhabitants in Greenland. So paying each one of them, say, $1 million in order to get them to vote in a referendum that they want to become the 51st or maybe by then 52nd state of the United States, that is not a completely outlandish scenario. But is that a democratic way to go about self-determination? I don't know. I think corruption and trying to buy people's votes, that's always existed. What's different is that now there is so much wealth accumulated in the hands of very, very few people that this kind of, if you want, large or super large scale corruption is much, much more likely. And something has gone really wrong there, in my opinion.
But it's very important that in the rise of populism, you admit the certain flaws of the left that to in a way also caused people to believe in populist leaders.
I don't think it's a flaw of the left. I didn't say that. I said it's a flaw of liberal democracies and to some degree of capitalism, which was promising things that they couldn't really keep, which was promising some degree of wealth distribution, but prosperity for all. That was promising that people would have, if you want, not just a free life, but a good life. And the truth is that if we look around this city, our city, London, you would see that that is simply not the case, that there are lots of people who've been left behind, including working class people who are, working very hard. And they have been left behind, maybe not deliberately, but de facto, not just in economic terms, but they've been left behind in terms of participation and feeling part of society. They just don't think that their voice counts. Now, that is obviously a fertile breeding ground for populists, but why did it come to that? Why do we have pockets of deep deprivation in my own borough that I represent as a councillor in Southwark? You only have to step across the street. You go literally 3 minutes from the billionaire rows along the River Thames down towards the south, a little bit further south, where you have some council estates where, people live in Dickensian kind of squalor. And it's a shame, really, on our system, on our quite left-wing, but also in if you want, right-wing parts of the country that are governed by the Conservative Party. It's partly even worse. So why is it that these people have been left behind? Why do they feel not listened to? It's not a left-right question, in my view. It's a question of whether our overall system that we call liberal, that we call capitalist, and free market, etc., is still serving these people well.
And what would you say? Is it still serving well? Is it the system we should go by?
Well, it's clearly something wrong with it, and it's very difficult to say, oh, that's what we need to fix, because obviously there is no easy fix. One thing I think we do need to fix is income inequality and wealth inequality through more redistribution. The other thing but how much is, a very difficult question to answer, and there is a debate even within my center-left party. The other question is what we can do about social integration and about people wanting to feel part of society. I'm a big believer in localism, which means that decisions are taken locally by people who, know their environment and have a stake in it and feel that they own, for example, their parks, their streets. They want them to be clean. They want them to be safe. They know where we need to build new homes for, people who are not able to afford homes, etc. And you should give them maybe a little bit more say in their own lives. So localism, where decisions are made at local level and not somewhere far away, I think that helps. The third thing that I think it helps is to involve people in decision making through some form of participatory events, like a town hall meeting or in a smaller community. Some civil society organizations, when you encourage people to just take some form of initiative, that can start in schools. That can start with civic education. That can start with clubs. It can start with blogs like you do, just to give people the ability to maybe speak up and be heard.